obsessed with yarn. I literally cannot stop doing this. It's so addicting that I do it until my hands hurt and then I force myself to take a few days off. There's around 70,000 stitches in a sweater and it takes weeks, if not months, to finish one. And it's basically just the same stitch over and over and over again, loops inside loops inside loops. So this should be boring as hell. And I have ADHD. This is honestly the last hobby that I ever thought I would be into. So why can't I stop? I'm not the only one asking this question right now. Fiber arts are having a serious renaissance.
Do you know how hard it is to stop knitting once you start? Do you know? Bitch, it's never, I'm gonna knit for 15 minutes. I'm gonna knit for 15 hours. Get this shit away from me. Like, it's so hard.
There are a few typical explanations that you'll find for this trend. It's a pandemic cope. It's a doom scroll antidote. It's a new way to form third places like craft circles in a time when everyone is super lonely and looking for connection. Personally, I started crocheting last summer because I developed really intense heat intolerance. Once the temperatures go above 80 degrees, I'm fucking down for the count. I was stuck inside in the AC and I needed a hobby I could do in a reclined position so I did not lose my mind to boredom. Yarn craft was kind of perfect for that. Then I found that it really calmed me down. And since it's portable, I started bringing my projects with me to help with my social anxiety. A lot of us have lost skills and gained chronic illnesses in the COVID era. So all of these are fine explanations for the 2020s resurgence of fiber arts, but I still wanted to know what is going on in my brain that makes me want to make these damn loops. At the beginning of this year, I decided that I needed to learn how to knit because crochet makes this like really stiff fabric that I absolutely cannot have touching my body. So I took an intro to knitting class at my local yarn shop. And while I was sitting there struggling to pull a loop through another loop with 2 wooden sticks, the teacher said something that stuck in my brain. It's harder if you think about it too much. You've probably experienced this in other ways, like playing an instrument or riding a bike. In sports, they talk about getting the yips, which you might think of as your mind getting in the way of your body. But there's a school of thought in cognitive science that views this a bit differently. Your body is your mind. You can trace this idea back to the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who argued back in 1945 that the body is the way that we come to know the world. In the 80s and 90s, linguists and cognitive researchers started exploring this even more. George Lakoff and Mark Johnson argued in the book Metaphors We Live By that our language is shaped by our physical experiences. Most of our metaphors, if you think about it, have to do with space and motion. We grasp concepts. We look ahead to the future. We drift apart from each other. We feel low and crash out. In 1991, Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roche published The Embodied Mind, which kicked off the field of embodied cognition. They argued that your brain is not a computer that just processes information. This is formally referred to as cognitivism, and it's been the prevailing metaphor for the brain for a very long time. The Matrix is a good example. A classic cognitivist tale. Neo gets hooked up to a supercomputer that feeds his brain sensory information that's so realistic, he can't tell that he's in a simulation. The whole idea that we actually live in a simulation is a pretty cognitivist worldview too.
There's some probability that we're in a simulation.
What percentage would you attribute to that?
Probably pretty high. I would say it's pretty high.
It assumes that your experience of life is just the result of models created in your brain. Your body is kind of irrelevant. So in theory, it could just be floating in this vat of goo while you're karate kicking a dude in the face. But these guys were like, that's not possible, because the nervous system doesn't just process information, it also creates information through interactions with the world. Cognition is enacted. What makes us different than computers is the fact that we are self-organizing systems. Your cognition, they argue, is embodied. You actually need your whole body to think. Pushing this idea even further, in 1998, Andy Clark and David Chalmers published a paper called The Extended Mind, where they argued that cognition can include physical objects outside the body too. Their example was a man with Alzheimer's who uses a notebook to remember things. The notebook becomes an external part of his memory. Our thinking extends into our objects, and the manipulation of those objects becomes a way that we think. The ceramics artist and researcher Camilla Groth calls it making sense through the hands. Making something, for Groth, is a form of thinking through actions, tools, things, and materials. The archaeologist Lambros Maliforis has a sillier name for it, thinging. He writes, cognition and emotion are not realized in the brain, but with a brain. That is, to think and to feel, we need more than a brain. Brain regions work in concert, but they are never alone. Rather, they are always parts of broader systems, extending beyond skin and skull. Maliforis argues that objects become material scaffolds, physical anchors we use to think. Like Clark and Chalmers' example of the notebook as a part of memory and dementia, Maliforis discusses the therapeutic uses of clay in mental illness. For schizophrenia, a condition that disrupts a person's sense of both self and time, manipulating clay can be a grounding activity. Quote, the patient's disorganized thoughts and actions, as well as uncontrolled movements, can be given an expressive direction and a sense of integration, coherence, purpose, and containment. For depression, the controlled malleability of clay, the fact that you can sculpt and resculpt, can, quote, provide a way to enact and reconceptualize past, present, and future. These are all ways to make sense with the hands, as Groth says. So maybe yarn had become a material scaffold for me too. In 2023, an article by April Rubin in the New York Times asked, is it rude to knit at work? The story was about a county councillor in Wales who had been called out on social media for knitting during virtual meetings. Knitters came to her defense, saying that it wasn't the same as scrolling on your phone during a meeting because knitting actually helped them pay attention. The article quotes Dr. John Ratey, who is kind of famous in the world of ADHD. He co-authored Driven to Distraction, the book that popularized the condition with adults in the 90s. Ratey says that knitting activates the prefrontal cortex, which is why it helps with attention. But I'm not totally satisfied with this answer. Because if cognition is embodied, then knitting with your hands is not just helping your mind attend, it literally is your attention. The repetition, the rhythm, the tactile sensation of the yarn, all of this together becomes a material scaffold for attention. It's really common for ADHDers to say that doing two things at once helps them focus, especially when the second thing they're doing is a kind of movement. Fidgeting, bouncing, pacing, doodling, all of these things keep you present. And knitting is the same. At least vanilla knitting or projects that are so simple they don't really require too much extra brain power. One knitter told the New York Times, as soon as I start knitting, I'm laser focused on that one person talking. I can tell you how many rows I knit, and I can also tell you everything that they just told me. It's a big thing for me. It's helped me honestly advance in my career and both of the organizations I belong to. There hasn't been a ton of research on this, but one study on crochet and attention published last year, found that the craft improved alerting and orienting on the attentional network test. Doodling during class has been found to help students retain more information and get better grades. And for ADHD students in particular, using a fidget spinner has shown a large immediate and sustained increase in time spent on a task. These are usually referred to as focus hacks for ADHDers, but I'm not really a hacks person. I just don't think they work. The subtext to focus hacks is the idea that linear, sustained attention is the only kind of attention. This is also the unspoken bit in the question of whether or not it's rude to knit during a meeting. Because if you think attention means sitting still and making eye contact, you'll probably be offended by someone who's not doing that. But there's more than one way to attend. If you haven't watched my video on Andrew Ivan Brown's University of Attention theory, stick that in your queue right now. It connects really perfectly here. Brown argues that ADHDers attend to everything as one thing. It's all connected, but the conventional view of attention is much more fragmented. You pay attention to one thing at a time, one after the other. This is assumed to be what attention is, full stop. So ADHDers who need to do two things at once to focus are seen as hacking into attention, when instead, I would argue, we're practicing another way of attending altogether, a way that's much more embedded in our environment and enacted through movement. The anthropologist Mika Nielsen has done some of my favorite work on ADHD. I've written about it before. I'll put a link in the description. But Nielsen thinks of ADHD as a desynchronized way of being in the world. Our internal rhythms are out of step with the rhythms of society. In her fieldwork, Nielsen found that people with ADHD were always talking about either running out of time or experiencing time passing too slowly. She said that during interviews, she often felt confronted with the feeling of restlessness, misconnection, and misinterpretation. And I experienced being at a different pace from the person in front of whom I was sitting. One of her subjects, Kenny, said, "When I go to a meeting, for example, where we have to sit on our butts and are being taught from the blackboard, then my legs start moving, I fiddle with something. It is like carbonic acid all over, and that energy needs to be released. So I will sit and jump a bit." Mika says, "So that is the valve?" Kenny replies, "Yes, it is. It brings calmness." If the experience of ADHD is one of being out of sync, you could see knitting as a way of pacing yourself, resynchronizing with the world around you. Nielsen calls these kinds of strategies time work. She draws on the work of another anthropologist, Mark Goodwin, who talks about becoming the moment. And I love how this phrasing ties right back into embodied cognition. Nielsen writes, "Rituals of self-stimulation enable the body to become the moment, a body that accrues time as a penalty in the form of understimulation, and that perceives this time as a burden. Becoming the moment means slowing down the acceleration of inner time and insisting on the present through movement." It's not just ADHDers who find yarn craft therapeutic. In 2024, researchers analyzed posts in a Ravelry group for knitters with mental illnesses called Knit Therapy. One user wrote, "While my hands are busy doing something, my mind slows to a crawl, and I'm actually able to think about one thing at a time rather than having 20 to 30 threads all going at once." The members of Knit Therapy discussed all kinds of ways that their craft acted as a material scaffold for them. Some used it as an alternative to taking anxiety meds, others as a preventative measure to stop a downward spiral. Knitting was also a kind of diary that helped them remember their lives. They could remember what they were doing and how they felt when they were making a piece, because those memories kind of got embedded into the work.
What I love about knitting, and I started only six months ago, it shows where I was in the time. So I started this 3 weeks ago. I was at home watching TV. So these are pretty clean. These are pretty clean stitches. And then you start getting into when I was on my 21st birthday, so they're becoming a little tighter because I was probably a little stressed, so I make the stitches a little tighter. And then right here is where they get looser because that's when I'm on planes and I'm tired.
That's what Malaflores would call a biographical object. For the members of Knit Therapy, knitting stood for security, safety, assurance, strength, and stability. It was something they could control in life, even when other things seemed unfair and out of control. Crafting can be a way to manage your brain, but it's also a way to make meaning in your life. Psychologists have a name for this, and it's kind of fitting considering our subject. They call it life crafting. It involves reframing your perspective and seeking out social support and challenges that help you grow. I know it's figurative, but literal crafting does all of these things too. One paper called "Why Our Brains Love Arts and Crafts" notes that it's a safe way to practice failure. When I fuck something up in knitting, it's not really that big of a deal because I could just unravel the yarn and do it over again. And every time I have to do that, I learn something and I get better. But probably the best benefit that the members of Knit Therapy talked about was how knitting improved their self-efficacy, or their belief that they could have an effect on the world. This is an experience that I think a lot of us need right now. There's so much really horrible shit going on in the world, and we have no control over it, yet we are cursed to know all about it in real time. News feeds amplify a sense of powerlessness, and this has actually been studied. The media spreads feelings of uncertainty, which make everybody way more anxious. So it makes a lot of sense to me that more people are turning to handicrafts, because doing something with your hands changes both how you feel and what you think is possible. I don't think this is merely a personal cope, because crafting is a very social activity and it has a long history of political activism. Elena of Cozy Books and Knits has a great overview of that history if you're interested. But for our purposes, I want to zero in on the arts and crafts movement at the turn of the 20th century, aka the Gilded Age, a time that parallels our own, in a lot of ways.
Gilded Age, coined by Mark Twain in a very famous novel. It refers to a period of time from the late 19th to early 20th century where the United States saw, among other things, rapid industrialization, economic growth, and those things intertwined with political corruption and wealth inequality.
As a good little Marxist, I was fully preparing to argue that people turned to handcrafts in response to being alienated from their labor under capitalism. But then I found that one of the key figures of the arts and crafts movement, William Morris, beat me to it by about 136 years. I have never had an original thought in my life, thank God. The movement was partly a rebellion against machines, which had taken over production during the Industrial Revolution. Morris argued that machine production had a few terrible effects on society. It severed people from the process of making things, meaning that they had no understanding of materials or how things came to be. Quote, almost all goods are made apart from the life of those who use them. On top of that, he thought machines made ugly things, which is, quote, a serious evil and a degradation of human life. I wonder what William Morris would have thought about Shrimp Jesus. He argued that because the market decides what gets made, we end up with all kinds of cheap, ugly slop that nobody actually wants. Quote, the art of making beautifully all kinds of ordinary things has gone. When anything has to be renewed among these simple things, the only question asked is how little it can be done for, so as to tide us over our responsibility and shift its mending onto the next generation. So like grayish house flips. But the worst thing for Morris was that industrialization took all the pleasure out of work. Spending 30 hours making loops into a shirt is completely impractical when I can just go to the store and buy one, but I do it because I get something out of it. It feels rewarding to me. Morris called this joy in labor, and he thought it would only be achievable in a society where the market worked for us instead of us working for the market. Quote, it is only a society of equals which can choose the life it will live, which can choose to forego gross luxury and base utilitarianism in return for the unwearying pleasure of tasting the fullness of life. For Morris, the turn to handcrafts was a sign that people felt like something was wrong with the capitalist economy they were living under, and they were longing for something different. He didn't think we could go back, though. The technology had already been invented, and he recognized that it had advanced society in some ways. What we needed was to be the master of our machinery and not the servant, meaning we need to use our technology to actually make life better for people, not to more efficiently extract value from us. I'm honestly kind of blown away by how much this essay from 1888 still applies in the age of smartphones and AI. Despite all these huge advances we've made in computing and engineering, handcrafts keep coming back because we are a species that thinks with our hands. We use rhythm and materials to sync ourselves to our environments. We make things to make sense of the world. I don't think anyone picks up knitting needles because they read Marx and they think it's going to be revolutionary. It usually starts as a personal cope for anxiety or illness or boredom. But when they start reaching out to each other to learn and grow and collaborate, that's when the craft becomes social and political. People want to weave things together. And despite all the horrors, that gives me hope. Thank you for watching. Check the description for all my sources. Subscribe to my newsletter to get my writing in your inbox on a regular basis. And let me know what you're crafting in the comments. In the meantime, stay gooey, my beautiful slugs.